Sometimes, of course, the king would want to be private. And when he did, he and his family would come through into the next room, in here. This is the chamber, and it's where the royal family would have slept. Well, nowadays it's just one great big room, but in those days it would have been divided up into sections with screens and curtains. Now, to get an impression of what this room would have been like in the 11th century, we need to do a bit more detective work. So what sort of things should we be looking for? What would William the Conqueror have needed to live here in reasonable comfort?
Well, I can think of one thing for a start. Now, in England, it's often a bit chilly, right? So the king and his family would have wanted to keep warm. So what they needed was a nice big fireplace. And that is exactly what we find. In fact, it's an enormous fireplace. Now, today, there are 3 of these fireplaces still in the White Tower, but back in Norman times, there might have been even more. And there could have been an open hearth in the middle of the floor, too. Now, we're not quite sure about this, but it's possible they also did their cooking on a fireplace like this. And looking at the size of it, you can easily imagine a couple of sheep roasting on a spit here, or possibly a small ox.
So that's how they would have kept warm, and how possibly they could have done their cooking. So what else would they have needed? Water. Drinking water. Now, they couldn't have got that out of the River Thames. That's far too dirty, isn't it? So where did they get it?
Let's see if we can find out. Now, I've just discovered this spiral staircase, so we shall go down it. Wait a minute, just noticed something. This staircase is at the corner of the White Tower, so that means it must go up in one of those turrets. So maybe that's why the turret is round and not square. Haha. Dead logical, eh?
I think he's right. The staircase Bill's going down must be inside that round turret on the corner there.
If we come down the staircase, we get to the bottom and we come out in the cellars. Look at all these weapons. Because back in Norman times, it would have been in the cellars. They kept all their weapons and probably their food as well. Aha! Now, you remember we were looking for water, right? See what I see? That's it. It's a well. And let's have a go. Ooh, it's a pretty deep well too. So obviously this is where they got their water from. But if you think about it, now this is a pretty weird place to dig a well, isn't it? I mean, surely it would have been easier to dig it outside somewhere in the Bailey. But no, they dug their well right here, right in the middle of the White Tower. Now that can't have been easy, but there must have been a reason for it. So, any idea what it was?
I wonder. And speaking of water, what about bathrooms? Where did they wash? Well, the answer to that is that the Normans didn't wash nearly as often as we do. In fact, they didn't have any bathrooms. They probably just used a basin. But they did have lavatories. Now, while you're exploring, if you come up to this end of the Great Hall, you'll find 2 little entrances. Now, people aren't normally allowed in here, but this one seems to be open, so let's have a look. Up the steps, round the corner, and there, sure enough, a toilet. Now, the Normans called this a guard-robe, and as you can see, it's pretty basic. There's no running water, just a sort of stone bench with a hole in it, and that hole leads down through the wall to the outside. So, if you were a Norman soldier out there, you'd want to be pretty careful not to stand underneath it.
Yeah, so that's what those holes were for. Anyway, now we're outside. Come around the other side because there's something interesting about the windows. Now, if you look up there, you see some of them are very, very small. Well, for hundreds and hundreds of years, all the windows were small. So why do you think that was? And why do you think they made them bigger later on?
I think it's to do with protection. If you're living in a castle and you're likely to come under attack, then the smaller your windows are, the less chance you have of being hit by an arrow shot by somebody out there. Of course, in later years, when there was no risk of that kind of attack, they could make the windows larger to let in more light.
Now, if you think about it, back in Norman times, in a room like this, it would have been quite dark. And it probably would have been very smoky too, because they had open fires, and all the lighting would have been with blazing torches. But just like in the chapel, the walls wouldn't have been dull, they would have been painted in beautiful colours, and they'd have had lovely tapestries on them, so the whole thing would have looked really, really grand.
So you might have supposed the kings would be happy to live here forever. But they weren't. They soon wanted somewhere more private, where they didn't have to live so close to everyone else, and somewhere larger with better defences in case they were ever attacked. In the second part of this film, we'll be looking at the Tower of London as it was later on, in the Middle Ages.
But before we leave the Normans, let's just go back to the entrance of the White Tower. Now, have you guessed why that door is halfway up the wall? And why are those steps made out of wood and not out of stone? Can you figure it out?
Any ideas? We'll see you in part 2.